Recording is now in progress. And Jean, I also made you a co-host so you can probably track if we have anybody join the waiting room. Jean and Zach, feel free to keep an eye out if we have folks in the waiting room today. So with that, let's hop into things a little bit tonight. Our agenda, we're going to start off talking about what exactly is a housing production plan and what is the process and what is the point of the document. Then talk about the process that we went through. Then we'll review the plan's contents and what each section is. After that, I'm going to dive into a bit of a chapter by chapter summary of the plan itself. And throughout this, we'll pause twice for questions and comments if folks want to have ask any questions, clarification questions, or offer any comments on their thoughts as the plan is shaping up. The plan, of course, is not actually in PowerPoint format, but we're presenting it tonight in PowerPoint. It is going to be a printed document at the end of the day, and you all will be able to view that once that is fully produced and ready and presented to the planning board. So what exactly is a housing production plan and what are we doing here? You might hear me refer to them as HPPs, the acronym. HPPs, they allow communities to articulate their vision for housing production in a comprehensive strategy. They're put over a 5-year period and are guided by state guidelines that recommend different components to include in the plan. Not only are HPPs a chance for communities to talk about their vision for housing in their community and how to address their housing needs, they're also a way that communities can reach what's known as safe harbor under the 40B statute in Massachusetts. Some of you may be aware of what 40B is. That's essentially a state statute that requires all cities and towns to have 10% of their housing stock be set aside as affordable. If communities are below that 10% threshold, then a developer can come in and build housing overriding certain local zoning requirements. So if you have a documented HPP that is approved by the state, and if you are making progress towards your development goals in that HPP, then a community can have some protection from 40B developments if they have not yet reached that 10% threshold. So number one, it really is a tool for your vision for how your community wants to create the housing it needs over the next few years. And number two, it is a tool that you can use to help control development in a manner that the town most wants going forward. So what exactly is the housing production plan process? And so as I mentioned, this is a 5-year plan. The reason why we have started them now is because the last time these were produced were in 2018, and so they were expiring throughout 2023. This update began roughly around January of last year. NVPC, in partnership with the Planning Department, the Housing Authority, the Housing Trust, and the Planning Board have all been looking at this and working on creating the data analysis that's important to then craft some strategies for the community. In addition to working with those relevant boards and town staff, there have also been 2 public engagement meetings throughout this work. So there was a virtual meeting back in September of 2023, and then there was an in-person meeting in December 23. So 2 opportunities prior to tonight for full public feedback. I will say in addition to that, we've also been to public-facing meetings with the Planning Board and Affordable Housing Trust throughout this process. Those 2 meetings listed there were just specifically for full public engagement outside of a typical board meeting. So as we've been working through this process and crafting the plan, let's talk a little bit about what the plan actually includes. Going forward in this presentation, I'm going to break down each individual chapter, but just to give you an idea of what the plan looks like, the first chapter is really an overview of what the community looks like, a summary about North Andover as it exists today, and a brief summary of the actual findings of the plan. The second chapter dives into the demographics of the town and some different population and resident profiles using census data. The third chapter digs into the local housing conditions, again, mostly using census data, but also using some other data sources throughout the plan. After looking at the data and how the housing conditions exist in the community, we dive a little bit into some considerations for housing development. So what are the things that when development is occurring in North Andover, we want to make sure that we're considering to make sure we have thoughtful development. And then the fifth and final chapter is really the key to this whole thing, those housing production strategies. So given everything that we've talked about and reviewed in the first 4 chapters of the plan, what are a few key strategies that the town could use over the next 5 years to help achieve its goals and help address any of the challenges that may have been seen in the earlier chapters? So like I said, we're going to take this chapter by chapter. After the first couple, I'm going to pause for questions. We're going to dive into a lot of data, and so I'm happy to entertain questions about the data itself. And then after that, we'll move into some of those zoning considerations and recommendations, and we'll pause for questions again after that. So chapter 1 is really just a community overview and a summary of the findings. I'm not going to spend more than one slide on this because it's really just an introduction to the plan. I just wanted to mention up front that that is the first chapter in the plan. So it includes an intro to North Andover, the process that we went through to produce the housing production plan, and it pulls out some key statistics that are important to keep in mind when considering housing development in town. And so those key statistics we're going to talk about tonight in a bit more detail as we dive into each individual chapter. So chapter 2, let's take a look at the demographic profile and some household trends. This is going to get into some data. I could spend an hour and a half talking to you all about census data, but I know that that will only put many folks to sleep. So we tried to pull out some of the key data points. There is more in the plan than what we're going to present tonight, but we kind of wanted to take away some major trends that we're seeing in North Andover that are important to consider with housing. So first, right off the bat, looking at North Andover's housing projection, population trends and projections. So you can see right towards the middle here, the census 2020, North Andover's population at the 2020 census was almost 31,000 at 30,900 residents. This then projects out, given current birth, death, and migration rates, what is expected for population growth in town. You can see that it is expected to grow modestly over the next 10, 20 years, and then it's expected to level off after 2040. This is roughly in line with what we see with a lot of our communities in the Merrimack Valley region. We see a growing population, but over time we see that, that growth starting to stagnate a bit. And so thinking about, as we craft housing goals, what does that mean for a community if you see your population going up, but maybe eventually plateauing? How can we anticipate the needs of maybe a stagnating population? And also, if we want continued economic growth, how do we ensure that there is manageable growth in the population? We're not saying that we need to explode in numbers tomorrow, but we certainly want a growing community because a growing community is a healthy community. And so thinking about the factors that might be causing that growth to stagnate, and that's going to play a role later on in the plan as we think about options for housing for folks in the future. The other key population trend that we look at are age distribution projections. So this looks at what percentage of your population is made up of various age cohorts. And so all the way on the left on this chart, you can see the census from 2020. All the way on the right is a projection into 2050. And each of those individual age cohorts have an individual line here. The biggest takeaway that we have with this is this blue line, which starts at the bottom back in 2010 and increases to the top of the makeup of age distribution later in 2050. So that's the 65 plus population. So we're seeing effectively over a 30 to 40 year period, that 65 plus population dramatically increase in its proportion as it is relative to the entire population. So in North Andover, and this is seen also again across the region, we have an aging population. So we want to consider what types of housing needs an aging population would need in order to have accessible and affordable housing. And that's a big factor in our considerations when putting together a housing production plan. At the same time that 65 plus population is increasing, you'll also notice that your younger population and younger age cohorts are going down as a percentage of their overall makeup of the population in town. This can have its own considerations and concerns as well. So thinking about, is there availability of housing for families? Is there availability of housing for young adults in the community? And why is that going down? And what are the implications for a decrease in that population for the town's overall vitality, economic, school system, that sort of thing? And how can we, make sure that we are either mitigating trends that we don't want to see or accommodating trends that we know are going to happen? These are projections. And so this is if everything stayed the same today, if patterns continue, this is what is projected to happen. Of course, if North Andover's conditions change, economic conditions or housing conditions, we could see these projections fluctuate. And so we want to figure out how do we get these trends in the right direction for the best growth possible for North Andover. So along with those age projections, we also talk a lot about school enrollment and how do we see school enrollment changing over time in town. The Local public schools are the biggest bar, the orange bar here, that is made up all the way from 2000 to 2020. What you'll notice is that, between 2000 and 2008, there was a slight increase in school enrollment. But then pretty much since then, in the past, well, I should say the past decade, but really the decade between 2010 and 2020, we roughly plateaued in population. We know that that was also occurring at the same time that there was housing development occurring. So despite an increase in housing types, we see a plateauing school enrollment. That's pretty typical for what is seen both across the region and across the state. We tend to find that there is not a huge correlation between housing development and school enrollment. So one of the things we try to think about, or I should say multifamily housing development and school enrollment, one of the things we think about is what types of units are being built, what kind of units do we want if we want to see either a plateauing school enrollment, or if we want to see more school children in our community, how can we make sure that we have the needs, the housing needs for families with children and the housing needs for school-age children to be around town. Another big factor that we look at when considering what potential housing needs are in town is the difference between North Andover's housing stock, how big the houses actually are, and then the residents that are in those households. What are the size of the families inside that housing stock? So on the left here is a pie chart that is housing breakdown by occupancy. So this is the amount of people that live in a household unit. On the right is the number of bedrooms in that housing unit. How big is that house? So one of the things that's a key takeaway here right off the bat is that 1 or 2 person households in North Andover make up about 54% of homes, but 1 or 2 bedroom homes, so homes that are the sizes of 1 or 2 bedrooms, make up only 38% of the town's housing stock. On the flip side, we see that 3 or more person households make up 45% of North Andover homes, while 3 or more bedroom homes make up 61% of North Andover's housing stock. So what we start to see is a little bit of a mismatch between the size of the family living in a home, and that's the size of the home itself. We certainly always expect to see a mismatch because we know some people will want to live in a home with an extra bedroom or 2. Some people might be empty nesters and they want their kids and grandkids to be able to visit. So they might be a 2-person couple and they still live in their 4-bedroom home. That's totally fine. And we want those options to be there for folks to age in place. The challenge that we think about when we see data like this is that we know if those 1 or 2 person households want to get into a 1 or 2 bedroom unit and downsize, they're facing a lot of competition because there's much less of those units than there are available necessarily for the demand there might be given the residents in town and the household size in town. And so we think about that mismatch and try to think of ways to ensure there's a more even spread of right size housing for folks that might be looking for housing that is closer to their needs and their size family. So now we're going to look at a little bit of housing condition data building off of that. After we go through these 6 or so slides, I'm going to pause for questions about the data as a whole. So if you're having questions pop up, feel free to type them in the chat and we'll get to them. Or at the end of this section, we'll do some hand raising and folks can feel free to speak up if you have questions. So the housing permit data, what exactly has North Andover been permitting over the past 20 or so years, and how has that development been occurring in town? You'll see consistently throughout all of the years, there's at least some single family housing permitting happening. And then the other biggest bar that we'll see that spikes in a few years over the past 20 plus years is that 5 or more unit development size. So that is those larger multifamily developments. And there are a few key years. I'm sure folks that are from town or have been in town for a while, you probably could figure out which developments are causing those spikes on those given years. It's important to note this is housing permit data. It's not necessarily when a building is making its way through the permitting process. So it's not until you finally get your building permit that you get put on this database. But you can see that North Andover has been doing a good job of producing multifamily housing in town relative to other communities that we see in this region, where there has been some pretty good housing growth of types of multifamily. At the same time, there's been consistent single family development. And so when we see that pattern, we see that there is, a good amount of housing being built. One of the things we consider is there anything missing in these types of housing units being permitted? Those maybe the green bar, like the 2-family, or the blue area, the 3 and 4 family, those smaller duplexes or smaller housing types that might be more accessible either for a young couple, a young family, or for folks downsizing. things like that we consider when we look at this. But certainly, the big takeaway here is that North Andover is producing units, and that's been a relative good thing over the past 20 plus years in town. Oh, apologies, I just skipped a bunch here. Alrighty. So then the next thing that we consider with the household makeup is really, can folks afford to live in the housing that they have right now? This chart talks about cost burden. Cost burden is a federally defined definition. And when a household is cost burdened, it means that they pay more than 30% of their gross income towards housing. So this is pre-tax income. And if you're paying more than 30% of that income towards housing, then you're considered cost burden. Severely cost burden means a household pays more than 50% of that gross income towards housing. As you can see in North Andover, about half of all renters are cost burdened. So half of folks renting in town are paying more for their housing than they can actually afford. Owners in North Andover are not immune to cost burdenship either, where we see 1 in 4 homeowners are actually cost burdened. Overall in town, 1 in 3 households are cost burdened. So what we start to think about here is, what does that mean both for affordability? Is there enough affordable housing around town? But what does that mean overall for the town's economy? If you're paying a third or half of your income towards your housing costs, you then don't have disposable income likely to spend at your local restaurants, shops, etc. So that effect of paying too much for housing and not being able to pay enough, maybe into the local economy, it has ripple effects throughout town. And so we try to think, how can we mitigate that as we're thinking about housing production and produce the type of housing that those folks that are cost burdened actually need. I will say about this, North Andover is not alone in these statistics. It's pretty typical across at least the Merrimack Valley region to see half of renters cost burdened. And that really just speaks to the overall overwhelming need for affordable housing options that we have across the Merrimack Valley and across the state right now. But certainly, as we think about North Andover's plan, how can we address residents here and what they need right now? The next thing in terms of affordability that we consider is what's called the affordability gap. And so the affordability gap refers to the gap that exists between what is the current cost of a home in town, but then also what can the median income household afford for a home. And so there's usually a difference there. In North Andover, that's certainly the case. So the median household income in North Andover at recent census data was $118,000. With that income, if you factor in a 20% down payment and current interest rates and costs for taxes and insurance, we get roughly that that income household could afford about a $440,000 home. However, in North Andover, the 2023 median home sale price was $648,000. So we see roughly a $200,000 affordability gap in town. So our median household income in North Andover cannot afford a median priced home in North Andover. So going back to thinking about our strategies, how can we make homeownership more accessible for your average resident in town? And how can we make sure that they are able to get into the housing that they need so that their housing costs are not higher, and back to that cost burden shift that we talked about in the previous slide. Again, North Andover is not alone in this. We see an affordability gap across most of our communities. It's not unique to town, but there certainly is a varying affordability gap depending on which community that you're in the Merrimack Valley and across the state. The next few slides, I'm going to hand it over to Jean to speak to a bit, because although these data points aren't specifically in the housing production plan, North Andover recently did a community needs assessment for seniors, where there was a survey about what seniors were looking for in town and what their needs were. And a lot of it was about housing. And because of that growing senior population we mentioned earlier, we wanted to take time to highlight some of the senior needs. So Jean, I'm going to hand it over to you to speak to a few of these points about what that survey and housing needs assessment demonstrated.
Thanks, Ian. As Ian said, that we recently had a needs assessment commissioned by the Senior Center to identify and plan for the needs and interest of the North Andover residents.
Oh, Jean, sorry, I think it got muted.
Okay.
There you go.
Yep. Okay. So as seen in the slide, survey respondents were asked, how important is it to you to remain living in North Andover as you get older? 69% of the residents 80 and older And 58% of the residents between 70 and 79 indicated that it was very important to them to continue to live in North Andover as they age. This is compared to only 44% of the residents 60 to 69 who said they would like to continue to live in North Andover. To assess the age friendliness of housing stock in North Andover, respondents were asked if they currently had a bedroom and bathroom on the entry level of their home. An important feature as occupants age and mobility up and down stairs becomes more challenging. This slide shows that 52% of respondents do not have this feature in their home. Given that over 80% of the respondents reported planning to stay in their current home over the next 5 years, having living space that can be accessible as residents age is crucial. I think you skipped a slide, Ian. Can you go back? Okay, so on the left-hand side of the slide here, the next question was centered around home maintenance needs. Maintaining home requires resources, including people who can make repairs and finances to pay for these repairs. In response to the question, does your current residence need home modifications, things like grab bars for showers and railings on stairs, to improve your ability to live in it safely for the next 5 years, 35% of the respondents stated yes. Among them, 7% cannot afford to make these changes, and 4% are not responsible for making such changes. Similarly, 30% of the respondents reported that their current residence needs repairs. Among them, 11% stated that they could not afford to make these repairs. And next slide, Ian. And lastly, this is a bit difficult to read, so we took it from the presentation to the senior center and got a little bit jumbled, but the survey respondents were asked the type of housing they would prefer if a change in health or physical ability required moving from their current residence in the next 5 years. Responses varied greatly by age group. Nearly 46% of the respondents aged 60 to 69 would choose a smaller single-family home to other options. Senior independent living communities were selected by 38% of the respondents ages 70 to 79 and 34% of the respondents 80 and older. Independent living refers to a wide range of residential options that afford older adults the opportunity to live on their own while taking advantage of various amenities and community offerings. Independent living residential options are usually designed and arranged specifically for older adults, and the type of housing they provide, from apartments to townhouses to single-family homes, can vary. The preferences for alternative senior living options by those aged 50 and older have implications for the future housing policy decisions in North Andover.
Thank you, Jean, for that breakdown of that important assessment. What we're going to do now, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if I may add, so this data came to us recently within the last week or so, and the plan as drafted currently doesn't really incorporate a strategy to address some of those slides. And so we do intend to incorporate a strategy that likely will link in with the Affordable Housing Trust goals to try to address some of those, especially the housing maintenance concerns.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, we got this recently and we want to incorporate it all to make sure it's a key part of the plan. I'm going to pause here since we just presented a ton of data and a lot of information. After this, we're going to talk about conditions in town and recommendations for housing. What I'd like to do is just see if there's any questions about any of the data we presented. If you have general comments, we might save those until the end, just in the interest of time. But I wanted to stop here and see if folks wanted to learn anything more about what we mentioned or had questions about it exactly before we move on in the presentation. So if you have a question, either type it in the chat or use that raise hand feature on Zoom. And if you can't find that, it's in the reaction section of your Zoom menu, or if you click more in your Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen, you can go to raise hand. And so I'll pause for a minute to see if anybody raises their hand here. And Jean, I can't see the chat, so if you happen to see if anybody mentioned anything in the chat, please let me know. All righty. I don't see any hands, so if Did anybody not find the raise hand button and just wants to unmute and ask a question before we move on? I'll give one last chance here. Feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question. Alrighty, well, in that case, we're going to cruise right along here. Easy group tonight, and talk a little bit about the housing development considerations. And so I'm not going to dive too deep into into the description of all these things. I think many of you might be familiar with it, but I'll kind of point out a few things that we talk about in the plan itself, and you can read the full plan and see exactly how it's written as we're drafting it here. So the big pieces and the big takeaways are, what are the infrastructure and environmental constraints in town? And so what we do is kind of talk about different open space protections, areas that the town might want to preserve, and also protections the town has in place right now as a part of its bylaw. So things like the water supply protection, overlay district, and other areas of town that are environmentally sensitive. We also take some time to recognize that the town has done significant research and analysis on its drinking water supply, and ensuring that in future development there is adequate water supply for future housing, recognizing that the town did a water supply capacity study in the past and kind of mentioning some of those results. And then public sewer availability and capacity. Although we don't do a full analysis as a part of the study, one of the things we mention here is the important considerations for when developments come forward to factor in the impact on public sewer and water in town. And a lot of that is already a part of North Andover's development process. Usually when a multifamily development is proposed as part of the permitting process, they have to go through their site plan review to show their anticipated impacts on local infrastructure. So really a lot of this is talking about what has happened in the past and things the town should consider as it moves forward with housing development and keep in mind with future projects. The other part of this section talks a lot about zoning constraints. It's really just zoning constraints. It's just a breakdown of each zoning district in town and what it allows for residential use. Won't be anything new to folks that are familiar with town zoning, but if you are interested, you can read about the 6 residence districts in town and what is allowed in those different types of districts, the varying types of structures and lot sizes, setbacks, etc., as is currently allowed in town. One of the key takeaways that we look at in the zoning constraints is much of the town is zoned for detached single-family homes as of right now, and also any multifamily housing development requires a special permit right now in town. One of the things that we put in there is the town is currently working through what's called MBTA communities, which we won't spend a ton of time talking about tonight, but that would allow at least one by right multifamily district. As the town's bylaws exist today, every multifamily housing development goes through a special permitting process as part of site plan review. So with all of that data in mind and all of those other constraints in mind, as we think about what does the town look like today, what do we think about for the future? And after we went through a couple of public engagement sessions, got feedback from the public about what they want to see in town, what they like, what they don't like, talked to the planning board, the Affordable Housing Trust, put together some draft strategies and got feedback on those strategies. We came to a point where in this plan, we have a list of about 5 or 6, I guess it's 5 to 7 strategies right now that are being recommended for the town to think about in the next 5 or so years. All of these strategies are not necessarily things that the town has to do over the next 5 years. Some of them are exploratory, and the town staff, the planning board, other folks in the community may want to look at analyzing, putting into effect any of these recommended changes, but it's certainly not written in stone. The other key thing here for the folks that may have seen the housing production plan from 2018, there was a lot of housing strategies listed there. It might have been over 20 goals that was listed in that initial plan. One of the things we tried to do this time around was be very tailored and specific and very conscious of making sure we had a few strategies that were feasible to implement should the town, the planning board, and other relevant commissions choose to move forward with them. We wanted to make sure that these things were tangible and doable over the next 5 years and not just a long laundry list of possibilities for everyone. So we're going to break down each of those strategies, talk about what they look like, and then mention a few things that have come up since we initially drafted these strategies. And then after that, we'll pause for some more questions and comments from folks on the Zoom. So the first strategy is considering the adoption of an accessory dwelling unit bylaw. Some of you may have heard of these before. Some of you may have filled out a town survey that recently went around last year. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are also commonly referred to as in-law apartments. But when we're talking about them in this context, we're talking about them as allowed to be rented out on the market for renters. So if a homeowner wants to have an attached, potentially detached as an option too, accessory dwelling unit that's like a one-bedroom attached unit, they could rent that out, and it could be both an additional rental unit available on the market, and it could be additional income for the homeowner. There's a lot of different ways the town could explore this, and as a part of the town survey, it started to explore it a little bit. So just as an example, an ADU bylaw doesn't have to be a free-for-all. Each community does it differently, where some communities require it to be a part of the existing structure, so it goes into an attic or a basement or a garage. Some communities allow an addition to be built onto the existing structure, but it has to be attached. Some communities allow completely detached ADUs, where think of like a larger shed in the backyard instead is actually an ADU. And so there's many different ways the town could produce a bylaw. And one of the strategies we're recommending is considering adoption of that and looking at what it could be, how it could be crafted for North Andover and fit North Andover's current needs. A bit of a not necessarily complicating factor, but something that came out that was unexpected while North Andover was exploring this option. Governor Maura Healey introduced a bill in the state legislature, and as a part of that bill, accessory dwelling units would be allowed as of right in every community in the Commonwealth. And so there are a few things in that bill. Again, it's just a bill. It is not anywhere near passage in the legislature at this point. There are specific things that her bill outlines for what ADUs would have to be in the laws they would have to follow. And so one of the things the town should consider as it moves forward is trying its best to align it with any potential future state laws around ADUs, but really just keeping track of that as the town considers ADUs. The select board made it a priority for them to analyze it in the community. And so as the select board and other various boards and commissions and town staff look at this, something to keep in mind is if there's legislation moving on the state level, working to make sure things are in line with that. The second strategy that we looked at was ways to expand opportunities for village center or downtown zoning and considering rezoning of the downtown. And so the town began this work back in 2022, really just to analyze options for rezoning the downtown area. And part of that rezoning includes possible changes to residential uses. And so this is really an opportunity for the town to look at the downtown area and see how housing can best fit and best enhance the experience downtown. So one of the things we're recommending here is the town to continue to investigate best ways to use the zoning as a way to create a mixed use downtown, create a variety of options. As the town's been looking at this and will continue to explore it, some key points of it that may be helpful are the ability to provide additional density in downtown, so additional housing units. This naturally puts more people living within what are potential shops or restaurants of downtown, and really a key part of making an economic and vibrant center of a community is making sure people are living there. So how could we use potential downtown rezoning as a way to encourage a more mixed use downtown and a more full day downtown where folks are doing things at night, in the morning, and in the day. The next two strategies, one is with the MBTA communities law. So I mentioned this in a previous slide. MBTA communities, for those that have not heard of it, is a new state law that requires every city and town that has access to a transit station or is bordering a community with a transit station to create a zoning district that allows multifamily housing by right, at least somewhere in the community. North Andover has been working through that process of creating a zoning district, and at town meeting coming up in May, residents will vote on that zoning district to be in compliance with the law. This is a state law, and there are penalties for communities that do not comply outside of potential lawsuits from the state and from the Attorney General. There are several grant programs that the town pretty continually applies for and receives that the town would no longer be eligible for. Things like major infrastructure projects or major building and capital plans and capital projects are things to be concerned about that the town could lose access to if it's not in compliance with this law. So that's one of the recommendations, because it is a housing related law, it is a state law. We're trying to make sure that the town reaches compliance, and it has so far been taking the steps there. The next strategy centers around starter homes and or homes to downsize in that are quote unquote right size. So this goes back to some of our comments earlier about making sure there's appropriate housing stock for the household size we have in North Andover. It also comes a lot out of continuous community feedback that we heard throughout our listening sessions, where a lot of folks were saying either there isn't enough starter homes for a young couple or a young family, or other folks were saying there isn't any options if they want to downsize from their 4-bedroom home. So one of the things we're encouraging the town to do is look at areas or different zoning best practices that could encourage the production of smaller housing units and housing units that are suitable for either a young couple, a young family, or folks that are looking to downsize if they no longer want to be in their larger home. One specific way that the town could address this is through what's called a quote unquote starter home district. A starter home district is just the state language for it, but it doesn't have to be your first home. It is also a downsizing district opportunity. There's a state law called Section 40, Chapter 40Y that outlines a way that communities can adopt starter home districts and offers incentives actually for communities to adopt these quote unquote starter home districts. Under a zoning bylaw in these districts, you would restrict the actual household size that a developer could build. So they may not be able to come in and build a very large, over $1 million home. You also restrict the lot size. So it couldn't be a 2-acre lot, but making sure they're smaller lot sizes, which can lead to smaller homes and more affordable homes. And a couple other things as a part of it that the town could follow to make sure that we are best incentivizing development of these right-sized homes. We're really referring to them as. So this was a state law that was passed recently that authorized communities to choose to adopt these types of zoning districts, and the state's Executive Office of Housing is currently drafting detailed regulations to articulate exactly how communities can adopt these districts if they choose to, and the certain regulations they have to follow. So once those regulations are released by the State Office of Housing or Executive Office of Housing, we'd recommend the town look into that and explore the feasibility of adopting a starter home district in North Andover. The next few strategies here, strategy 5, ongoing community education. And when I say ongoing community education, one of the things we refer to is really two-way education, both educating residents and maybe planning board or other board members about whatever the housing needs are or housing gaps in town, but also residents' opportunities to educate the town on what they want to see in the community. And so conducting ongoing community education for both residents and the town alike to understand what is needed, and really for residents and members of citizen boards and commissions to understand what housing best practices are, what are ways to approach it, what are ways to mitigate concerns folks might have about housing. This was a strategy that was identified in the past housing production plan, and there was some progress made over the past few years where the town has done housing outreach initiatives. There still remains a desire to continue community education on this. We heard from folks at our community engagement sessions during this plan that we have all this information and we're dumping all of this data and information on them, and they wanted more opportunities to learn about housing needs. So finding ways to make sure we can continue that conversation in town. The next strategy is something North Andover is already doing, but we'll have to continue to do, which is called Housing Choice Community Designation. This is a designation that is offered by the state for cities and towns that are producing a certain amount of housing over a few-year period. The town has twice received designation as a quote-unquote housing choice community. And what that does is it opens up the town to exclusive grant programs that other communities do not have access to. And it also gives the town preferential treatment when applying for competitive statewide grant programs. So when you're applying for a state grant to fix something in town, you can check that box that says you're a housing choice community, and it gives the town more points. That designation has to be reapplied for every few years. Currently, the town is on a cycle where its designation will expire in 2025. And so we would be encouraging the town to retain this designation and ensure it has access to the state funds that are allowed to communities under this designation. Strategy 7 about regional collaborations. This is really to make sure that the town is talking to its neighbors and talking to its communities across the region here. We know that our housing challenges do not exist in a vacuum. North Andover can't solve the problem on its own that we see with housing, nor should it be solving the problem on its own. And so there are opportunities both regionally and locally with just the abutting neighboring communities to talk about housing needs and address it as a region and as a state, and making sure that there's continued dialogue so that there is that cross collaboration across communities. And then the last bullet I have in here is really just saying that these are the draft strategies as we have them today. A week or two ago, we met with the Affordable Housing Trust to go through these and give them a similar presentation. And they gave plenty of great feedback on a couple of other tweaks or changes they'd want to see to the strategies that we're going to work our way in. One of those strategies is what Jean was mentioning earlier, where we want to see something where we can work with we can work with the Affordable Housing Trust to address housing needs of seniors and finding and identifying ways to help seniors either stay in their home and age in their home or just age in their community and have options elsewhere. So that, along with a couple other things that they recommended, we're kind of working through to make sure it's included in this plan. We'll also be going forward to the planning board and getting their feedback if they want to see changes here. Before I pause after this, Jean, do you want to add anything on the feedback we received to date on these strategies?
No, I think you've covered it, Ian.
Okay. So that concludes this section of the presentation. What I'd like to do now is open it up for questions and comments, whether it's questions about the strategies you mentioned, anything we mentioned previously, if something popped up that you're wondering about with the data, or feedback on how this is being laid out so far. If you think anything is glaring that's missing here, if you really like something we mentioned, we'd love to hear that too. As a part of the final chapter of the plan, we also recommend really an action plan for implementing some of those strategies and potential timelines, potential funding sources. Again, it doesn't all have to be done, but it's things that, if the town wanted to do strategy 2, could that be done in year 2? And where could we get funding to do that? So if folks have things that they really like, it's great to hear that too, so we know how to prioritize those different strategies. I'm going to stop talking here because you all have been so patient listening to me talk for the past 45 minutes or so. And again, I'm going to leave the opportunity for folks to use that raise hand feature in Zoom. Let us know if you have a question, and we will be happy to listen to your thoughts. I will pause there. Maybe folks were getting a little too much sunshine today and we're tired so far. Oh, Bill, go ahead, Bill. Feel free to ask your question.
Sure, thank you. A very informative presentation, I meant. How well did we do in terms of the 2018 plan, in terms of like metrics, in terms of housing units added and so forth? So like, did the first 5 years go well, and how is that informing the next 5 years? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there were a couple things that I think I'd highlight from the past plan that we were looking at coming into this one. And Jean, feel free to fill in some gaps if I miss anything. Number one, production of overall housing units. We saw earlier that the town was producing units, which was great. One of the challenges we saw is a lot of those units ended up being market rate units. As a part of that past plan, something that was encouraged was inclusionary zoning, which the town adopted at town meeting. Maybe it was 2 years ago now. And so that inclusionary zoning policy will now require developments going forward to incorporate affordable housing in their developments. I believe there was a development just permitted on Main Street that will be its first inclusionary zoning development. That was a key part of the plan that was implemented. In addition to that, the last plan also talked about accessory dwelling units, like this plan is as well. However, last year, the town started to look into that. And so towards the tail end of that 5-year period, the select board said, now we want to prioritize this, and they started looking into it. So we're about halfway there, and the recommendation is to keep moving that forward. The housing choice community designation was mentioned in the last plan as well, and the town was successful in retaining that designation during that 5-year period. And there was also recommendations for ongoing community education, like we have again in this plan. And the town held, I believe, a housing forum, maybe that was 3 years ago now, to educate folks about certain housing needs in North Andover. That's the top of my head, on the top of my head, for things that we saw in the last plan. Jean, does anything else stick out to you that the town had done recently that was in line with the housing production plan?
No, so you caught all the ones at the top of my head as well. But Bill, we did a presentation and we checked off the ones that we did accomplish. So I'll dig that back up and send you an email that lists the ones that we did address. I would say probably the most disappointing is we didn't move the needle on affordable housing, ones that qualified to be on our subsidized housing inventory or the 40B requirement of 10%. And going forward, because we did pass that inclusionary zoning, we may start moving the needle on that with any future development.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the answers. Very informative.
Thank you, Bill. Any other questions out there from folks? And I'll leave the opportunity, if you can't find your raise hand feature, feel free to unmute and speak up if you want to. We can do popcorn style. All righty. Hearing none, thank you all so much for taking your time and being with us on this Wednesday evening. We're projecting an hour, so we'll give you 10 minutes back of your Wednesday night. We are reachable. Feel free to reach out to Jean or myself. Jean also has my contact information if folks have thoughts after this. We'll be meeting with the planning board in May and meeting with other members of town throughout the select board later on in the spring, early summer with this plan. So there'll be other opportunities for public feedback and sentiment. But with that, thank you all for attending. And feel free to reach out later on if you have any other questions about the plan. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.